I wanted to mention Bob Putz, who was one of my heroes and my good fishing buddy. He was one of the originators of the idea for this training center. I'm sure Bob Bird had something to do with it as well, but they worked in concert, and I think this has been a wonderful addition to America's capability of not only remembering what's happened in the past, but also making plans for the future and recertifying our commitment not to let those precious possessions of our country be wasted in future years. Well, I also had a very good friend, Marty Murray. You mentioned the Murray family. Her husband had passed away by then, but they were the ones that were called on by President Eisenhower and others to go up and make a survey of the area that finally turned out to be, they called it then the Arctic Refuge. And in 1960 that was formed. And now, of course, this 8.9 million acres to begin with, in 1980 we were able to expand it to 19 million acres, which is about the size, I can measure size by how big a state is. That's about the size of South Carolina, by the way, and with 8 million acres of wilderness. Well, this afternoon, I'm just going to give you a little bit of history lesson about my own involvement, but also save some time at the end, if Jay will permit us to have a few questions and answers. In 1976, when I was elected to the president, Mo Udall was one of my most tenacious opponents. He was one of my 9 or 10 fellow candidates for president that never backed down. He never won a primary. I won most of them, but he never did back down. And so we were still friends. And when I got to finally prevail in November of 1976, Mo Udall immediately contacted me about the possibility of doing something about Alaska lands. As Tom would know, and many of you would remember, Eisenhower was president when Alaska became a state. And 20 years later, when I became president, nothing had been done about Alaska lands because it was so highly controversial. There was a constant struggle between people who wanted a small amount of wilderness area, some national parks, a lot of state parks, land to go to the natives, land to be set aside for hunting and fishing, land to be preserved, land to be made into forestry areas, and also some to go to the state for management on its own. And there was a deadlock, and nobody knew how to answer this most important question: what are we going to do about the Alaska lands? There was no solution for that 20 years, primarily because of the complexity of the question, but because of senatorial courtesy. Senator Ted Stevens and Mike Gravel, and the only congressman they had from Alaska, were able to block any action. And I had a very strong majority in the House of Representatives among Democrats. We passed it without any trouble with Mo Udall's help. But when it got to the Senate, there was no way to make any progress. And it was deadlocked because nobody wanted to violate the right of 2 senators from a state saying, we don't want this to be done. So it was held up. And Cecil Andrus was my Secretary of Interior, a wonderful outdoorsman from Idaho. And he and I shared a joke that will illustrate very clearly the reason why we were able to get ANILCA passed. The joke was, this young man came back from Vietnam. He was a veteran, a very small, very timid guy. And he went in a tavern one afternoon and he asked for a milkshake. And he was drinking his milkshake, and a big brute came in and sat down next to him and began to tease the little veteran because of his timidity and because he was a Vietnam veteran. They were not very popular in those days. And he finally couldn't arouse any opposition from the little veteran, so he got more and more abusive. Finally, when the big guy had 3 or 4 drinks, he finally reached over and pushed the guy off his stool, and the guy didn't fall, but he was pushed off his stool. He said, that's a jiu-jitsu jab from North Japan. The little guy still didn't say anything. And the big guy had 2 or 3 more drinks and finally got more and more abusive, and he slapped him beside the face and knocked him flat on the floor. He said, "That's a karate chop from South Korea." The little guy didn't say anything. He got up and walked out of the bar, and he came back in about 15 minutes. He walked up to the big guy and hit him right between the eyes, and the big guy rolled across the floor and wound up unconscious under the table. The little guy said, "If he wakes up, tell him that's a tire tool from Western Auto." Well, Cecil Andrews and I had a tire tube, and that was the Antiquities Act of 1906, which had been designed in those ancient days just to let a president and a Secretary of Interior, president, of course, pick out a particular site. It was called a monument. And you would pick out a monument and maybe 5 or 6 acres around a monument, like a historic building from the Civil War or from the Revolutionary War. And you could designate that as a precious place. Well, Cecil and I had an idea, let's expand it a little bit. So we began to identify in Alaska the precious places we wanted to preserve. And I declared individually that they were national monuments, 17 of them. And the cumulative size of them was 67 million acres, about the same size as the state of Minnesota, to put it in perspective. And Ted Stevens threatened to go to the Supreme Court, which he did. He got the oil and gas companies to go to the Supreme Court. They all collected to try to show that what I was doing with the monuments designation was unconstitutional. To make a long story short, the Supreme Court ruled in my favor. But it was because of that ability that I had under the Antiquities Act of 1906 to designate any place I wanted in Alaska that Cecil and I agreed on as a national monument and preserve it, that made Ted Stevens begin to negotiate with me. So this was in 1978, and slowly but surely we formed an alliance. Ted Stevens was an honorable man, but he saw that he didn't have a tire tool that I had. So eventually, as all of you now know, on the 2nd of December 1980, I was able to sign ANILCA. And that was a very wonderful achievement in the Senate. It passed 78-14. Stevens and Mike Gravel both voted against it. And it was 106 million acres in conservation, which is just 3 million acres larger than the state of California. That's how big it was. Well, and we gave 44 million acres to the Alaska natives for their use and 100 million acres to the state of Alaska. So there was a very complex, the bill was that thick. It was enormously complicated. And I probably spent more time when I was president studying the map of Alaska and its most minute detail than I did any other place in the world. This was a very unpopular thing that we did. As a matter of fact, I was burned in effigy in Fairbanks. And when they had the state fair, they had one of those baseball pitching things, and you throw and you hit some and somebody falls in. They had one with my picture on it and one with the Ayatollah Khomeini's picture on it, and 90% of them were throwing at me instead of the Ayatollah Khomeini. I went up there later on the way to a funeral in Japan, and the Secret Service advised me not to go because of the large number of anti-Carter demonstrators that would be there because ANILCA had passed. Well, we set aside 95% of the Alaska coastal region for oil exploration, and we were confident that the refuge would be safe forever because the law required that a president would have to approve and both houses of the Congress would have to approve. We never dreamed that 3 bodies like that, the White House, the Senate, and the Congress, would all make that horrible mistake. But it only took a few weeks after Reagan became president that he appointed James Watt to be his despicable Secretary of Interior, and they began then to make a move to open up ANWR for oil drilling. Well, this is going on now constantly since I left the White House. Almost every time you have a Republican administration in Washington, both of Bush's and as well as Reagan, there are new moves to open up for oil exploration, oil drilling. And so far, we haven't been able to get a Democratic administration to protect it firmly. We just have to remain vigilant. One day, I remember, just one day in 1981, right after President Reagan became president, he changed the automobile efficiency standards, which was mentioned a few minutes ago, and increased it by 1.5 miles per gallon. That cost more in wasted oil than the desecration of the coastal plain or the wildlife refuge in all of its oil reserves. We wasted more oil with 1.5 miles per gallon efficiency on automobiles than all of the ANWR could ever produce. In fact, if we just drained it dry of oil and desecrated those lands, it would only serve America's needs for about 6 months.